Welcome back, everybody. I hope you're refreshed and ready for our next session. A lot to take in already this morning, and I hope you're eager and anxious to get us going through the rest of the morning. We've got our first panel starting right now. So we've got our first panel today is going to discuss legal perspectives on Indigenous identity, and it'll be presented by Jean Taillé, Leah Ballantyne, and Marilyn Patra. Jean Taillé is Métis from Red River and a senior counsel with Pape Salter Taillé LLP, specializing in Indigenous rights law. She is also an author, treaty negotiator, and women's and Indigenous rights advocate, as well as the great-grandniece of Louis Riel. Leah Ballantyne is a Cree Esquire lawyer with a demonstrated history of working with First Nations organizations in both for-profit and not-for-profit corporations. She currently practices at Leah Ballantyne Law Corporation and is the director at large of the First Nation Health Authority Board of Directors and a former member of the University of Saskatchewan Senate. Marilyn Patra is Michif and Irish-Scottish, born and raised in Southern Saskatchewan, and is an ethical space designer, public speaker, positive deviant, educator, as well as a lawyer and former law professor. She attended the Native Law Center summer program, obtained her LLB at the University of Saskatchewan, her LLM at Harvard Law School, and learns Indigenous law from elders and the land. This panel will run for 60 minutes, and there'll be about a half hour at the end for the panelists to answer some questions. And you may submit your questions through the Q&A function on your screen. Please note that the questions will be moderated before being posted. So please join me in welcoming Jean, Leah, and Marilyn.
Okay, we had no discussion about who goes first here. so I don't know, Marilyn, Leah.
I was just looking at the list. I was looking at the list and thinking it was you.
Okay, I will go. Thanks. Leah, that's okay with you? Okay.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So, all right, so I'm honored to be on this discussion today, really. And it is an important one, and I'm really honored to be with Leah and Marilyn, two other lawyers I greatly respect. So, and I know there's a lot of people out there who really have a lot of questions about this issue. So I wanted to start, we're the legal panel, so I wanted to start and raise a few of the issues that I see as legal issues that arise in this. So I want to start by saying, first of all, there are two sides to the legal issues here, because of course there are Indigenous laws about identity and about citizenship, and there are the sort of settler laws about these things. And I think we have to think about both of those because they have to meet somewhere. And we have to find a way to find an interface on these two issues. So I think you heard some of the Indigenous traditional customs and laws from one of my respected elder, Maria, and also from Murray, who is another greatly respected legal voice in Canada. So the way I think about it is this. So Indigenous peoples all have their own laws about their own citizens. So the Métis Nation has its laws and customs and traditions about who its people are. The Cree have theirs, the Stalo have theirs, the Mi'kmaq have theirs. Everybody's got their own way of understanding who their people are. And I think what we need to do is articulate those laws in our own communities. So we need to know, what are our laws about who belongs to us? How do we bring them into the nations? How do we deal with those who claim they are us but aren't? And then how do we communicate with institutions like universities in letting them know what our laws and customs are, because we can't assume they know, right? So I think we have to, first of all, our responsibility is to articulate for ourselves who we are. But it's not, this isn't just a single responsibility, right here. So there's responsibilities on our side and responsibilities on the Canadian settler institutions. Since we're talking about universities, I'm just going to talk about them. But I want to caution everybody here, these same issues are arising within the federal government, within arts institutions like the Canada Council and things like that. So this is a very broad issue. All of. So I want to start by saying, with respect to settler laws now, Indigenous identity is not an individual right. And I think that's one of the most important things that settler law gets wrong. They think it's a right as in, because their basic framework of laws is that Western liberal idea of based on individual rights. And this idea that Indigenous identity is an individual right, and that because it's an individual right, it is unassailable. That the minute I claim to be Indigenous, you can't question me because I know who the people say this. I know who I am, etc. You can't question me, and because they claim it as an individual right, that scares institutions, right? It scares the people who are hiring. It's scared because of employment law and because of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is about individual rights. They think it means they can't question it. They think it's as if someone's saying, well, I'm gay, or I have my particular religion. So it scares employers because they think it's an individual right. And I want to say that it isn't an individual right. Indigenous identity exists only because you are connected to a collective and you arise out of that collective. So it is not an individual right. There is some aspect of individual right about it, but that is not the major issue. The major issue is that you cannot exist as an individual, as an Indigenous person, disconnected from the people you come from. Now that, I don't mean that to say that if you lost your connection to your community because of marriage out rules in the Indian Act or residential schools, that you're not still part of that people. You can be part of that people. You still come from that people, right? So there are issues that we have to navigate around those who have been forcibly taken away or alienated from our communities. But that is not the same thing as people who are basically settlers who are standing up and claiming to be us. So it's not an individual right. And I think you heard Marie and Maria speak very heavily about relationships, about kinship relationships. So I want to say also that I think that the terminology of identity is problematic, because the minute you use that word identity, then that is an individual concept. And there's a sort of a new agey kind of idea out here that I can be who I want to be. I can make myself into whatever I want to be. And so I can claim to be Indigenous and you can't touch me because of, as I said, it's unassailable. So I think identity is the wrong word. I think we should always be acknowledging that our peoples are nations. We're not states, but we're nations. And because it's nations, there's citizenship is what we're really talking about. We're talking about whether you are citizens. The minute we use words like identity and membership, the minute you use words like membership, people start thinking about it like it's a club, right? Like you're the Girl Guides or you're the soccer moms or something like that, right? So I think we shouldn't talk about membership, and I don't think we should talk about identity. I think we should be talking about citizenship within our nations. So I think that's one of the other things. The other thing that I've heard a lot in the last little while is that people are very confused about what self-determination means. So the UN Declaration uses self-determination all through. There's probably, of these, I don't know how many clauses there are. There are dozens that talk about self-determination. I want to emphasize that self-determination and the right of self-determination is not about individuals. That's the right of the peoples. That's the collective right to determine for itself who they are, who we are. And then one of the major rights of self-determination is the right to say who your citizens are. And that's a primary foundational concept in law, in domestic law and in international law and in Indigenous law. So I think that's a really important thing. Now, a couple more things I wanted to talk about. So citizenship, if we are nations, citizenship is not necessarily about blood. Nations should be able to decide who their members are according to their own laws and their own customs and their own traditions. And that's it. They get to decide who their citizens are. And if we truly are nations, then that decision is up to those people. And if they choose to bring in people who are not connected by blood into their nation, that's their decision. But it has to be done, if they do bring people in, according to their laws and their customs and their traditions. If we say it's only about blood, then we're starting to talk about race and not talk about nations. And I believe that Indigenous peoples are polities, we are nations, and so we should be talking about citizenship. Okay, so that might sound controversial, like that they can bring in people who are non-Indigenous into their polity. But I think it's actually true that they can do that if their rules and laws and customs can do it. It isn't about blood, right? So one of the things that has to happen then is that we have to understand what the rules are. Okay, so what are the nation's rules about adoption in? What are the nation's rules about their citizenship? So one of the things that I've seen very clearly, and to clarify about adoption, is that not all peoples have adoption rules. Some peoples do, some peoples don't. But if they do, it's not about adoption by an individual, and it's not about adoption by a family. If you are adopted by an individual and you're non-Indigenous, and you're adopted by a family, or you're adopted by a family, that just brings you into the family. It doesn't make you a citizen of the nation unless the nation brings you in according to its laws and it says you are a citizen of that nation. So distinguish between the familial concept, which is very important, and many peoples do that, bring people into their families. That's different and not the same as bringing them in as a citizen. So if you're brought into a family, it doesn't mean you can stand up and say, I'm Cree. It means you're adopted into that family. But if you're adopted by the nation and the nation says that you can do that, that's a different thing. So I think those are all really important things to do. And I want to talk about two more things. So the difference between the local community and the difference between the nation. If we accept that Indigenous peoples are nations as political entities, and I hear a lot of people say they're just politicians, as if that's a put down. It's actually correct, right? It's right that we have the right of self-government. We are governing ourselves as peoples according to our laws and our customs and our traditions. It's important that we be political entities and that we have bodies that establish those rules. Now it's up to us as to how those get established. Do your elders establish them, or are they established in big assemblies? How do we do that? Everybody does that differently. I'm not looking at the inside rules for this. I'm trying to look at sort of the big broad picture rules of this. So the role of the community in this is not, the community is not the nation, right? The nation is the larger people who speak all the same language and have the same customs and the same traditions. That's the nation. And it's the nation who sets the rules about how they are. So the community, subgroups of the nation, the family, an individual, or a small local community shouldn't be able to bypass the rules of the nation by bringing people in. It should be set here, and you should be able, and the people, the local community is part of that. discussion. Now, if there's disagreements about it, then they got to work it out internally, right? About how that works. They may say the local can do it, but can the local bind the larger group, right? Can the local bring in whoever they want, despite what the rules of the larger group are? That's an internal issue that, say, the Cree have to figure out, or the Métis Nation has to figure out, right? So that issue of local versus the nation is another one. And I'm just going to stop with one more issue here, which is privacy. I don't know how, probably most of you didn't, because you're not law geeks, and I am. You probably didn't look at the statement of claim that Michelle Latimer filed in the courts when she sued everybody. But basically one of the claims she made was that she had a reasonable expectation of a right to privacy to her Indigenous identity claim. And if we weren't in a forum like this, I would use other language that starts with a B and an S, but it's basically can't be true. You have no right, if you are putting yourself forward as Indigenous and you are getting work because you're Indigenous, and you say you're Indigenous, and you are moving out into the public realm based and winning awards and getting money, and you've got all of these things that you're claiming because you are Indigenous, you have no right to privacy to this. And so that's another thing that universities are afraid of, right? They're afraid of the charter right to, that it's an individual right that's protected by the charter. And as I started off saying, I don't think that's right in law. I also think you have no right of privacy when you claim Indigenous identity and you put it out there in public. You cannot then reasonably expect that nobody can question you on it. And I'll just end with this. We must question it. We must be able, and we all do it. When, when I talk to Marilyn, I say, gee, my great grandmother was a Poitras. Who we must be related, right? And so we have these kinds of discussions, all of us, we all do. Who are your relatives and where do you come from? And that's it. So I say, yes, I'm a Riel and a Poitras and a Fisher and a Grant, and I was born on the banks of the Red River, and that's who I am. I'm your classic Red River Métis, right? That's who I am. So everybody should be able to do that. As Maria said, place is important. We should be able to place ourselves, and we should be able, in geographically, what's your community? Not just I'm, from a treaty area or something, but place yourself geographically in your community and place yourself in your relatives. Who are your people? And so I think that's the grounding right. That's what we have to do. Now, the discussion with the universities legally is going to be setting out fair processes for how the university can understand who people are. Some of us have cards. I have a Manitoba Métis Federation card. Those were the easy ones. if you've got cards, that's the easy ones, right? But lots of people don't have cards and they don't have to have them. So the challenge for the universities and for us is, okay, how do we not automatically exclude these people, but set up fair processes whereby they can still move forward with their identity and not be forced to get a card if they don't want to. So I think those are the issues that I see arising in law around this. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to hearing from my two colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Marilyn, I'm happy to finish up after you. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Leah. So thank you, Jean, for getting us going with that. I want to say good morning. Good morning to everyone. I want to say, Ninanaskaman, I am grateful. Ninanaskaman and Uchkagisika, I am grateful to walk one more day on Mother Earth, to get up and have the sunshine and hear my new puppy barking in the kitchen. I want to honor all the teachers that bring me to the place where I am today. I want to be grateful for the invitation to speak, Ninanaskaman. I'm grateful to our elder, to the welcome from the chief, to the drum, to the musicians, to the president, and to Chancellor Sinclair. I'm grateful for Neil for holding space for us today in humility and honor and humor the way he always does. Now, why would we always go over those things? Why are we always sort of going back to the thank you and remembering and talking about those places that make you know why you're connected, who you're connected to? Because that's our teachings. If you've ever been in any ceremony ever, our prayers all start with Ninanaskoman. We are grateful. I am grateful. What am I grateful for? I've seen elders pray for the things that they're so grateful for to the point of tears. And we start with a drum, the heartbeat of the mother. We start with bringing all of those thoughts together with people who remind us we know who we are. Who are your elders? Who are your grandmothers? To bring us all as close as we can to the same space so that we can go into this journey. I've been really torn about whether I say my ceremonial names or not. One of the ceremonial names I have, I got in a ceremony after my son had nearly died 3 times and was hospitalized for weeks. And another one I got from a woman who's adopted me, Gladys Wapas Gray Eyes, and in a ceremony with her and a ceremony keeper out at Thunderchild. And I want to say them because we're talking about identity. And so the first name I was given is Askia Squeo, Askia Wasis, so Mother, Earth Child. And the teaching that came with that was when change is coming, big change, seasonal change, change in people's lives, I will see the signs of the changes that are coming, like deer in rut, like spring awakening, like the actual systems coming to life before action's taken place. And I didn't fully appreciate what that name meant. And of course, the longer you carry your name, the more it seeps into who you are and into your life and your blood and your bones. And so I'm coming to honor that more and more. Miku Pisu Esqueo is a red thunderbird woman, and that name I've only had for 3 years. And so I'm just getting used to her and understanding her work. And Miku is a Cree word for blood. And so what does that mean? So I'm going to say hello. My name is, my ceremonial names are Askia Esqueo, Askia Wasis, Miku Pisu Esqueo. Hello, family. Now, who are we? I want to invite you to review the speakers and participants here today and tomorrow, cadre of amazing thinkers and doers and believers. And in addition to this list, in addition to the people that you can see around you, we can all come up with 50 more names off the top of our heads that could replace us in this space. Replace us with their words of insight, their education, their encouragement. So I just want to lift my heart and my hands to the work that everyone does and the work that we do to keep our spirits alive, both in the institutions that we take up space in and on our lands, in our homes, and in our communities. I want to say thank you for coming to think with our hearts and our spirits, as well as our intellect, to share opinions we have on Indigenous identity. We will not all agree. We will not all say the same thing. That's not only important, it is necessary. We are not the homogenized caricatures that we have been painted to be. Individual identity and experience and teachings and guidance are crucial. We're here to learn, to understand, to contribute, and protect, just like any citizens in any nation. There are many Canadians that have and express opinions on who they see are the Indigenous people, the Indians, the half-breeds, the Métis, the Inuit, the First Nations, the Aboriginal, the Natives, all of whom have now been determined to be Indians for the purposes of Section 9124. These opinions are rampant. because they perceive us in very simplistic terms and constructs in a way they would never do on other issues. They wouldn't talk about the environment that way. They wouldn't talk about foreign affairs that way. They wouldn't talk about the economic situation of the country or the world that way. Indians are seen simply to be a minority of dependent people that the government has had to deal with for hundreds of years. And when we are viewed in this way, simply, everyone has an opinion. We are a problem. In fact, we are the problem. We are the Indian problem. Specifically, the problem is that we exist at all. We will not submit. We will not go away. We are unemployable, uneducable, unwanted, addicted, poorly parented, and dependent. We constantly need a hand up. That's the us and them version of Indian, with good guys and bad guys and hard workers and lazy and the deserved and the undeserved. That's the easy version of the Indian problem, the one where no one else has to look at their own identity or cultural history or privilege or at the creation of the Indian persona through the colonial experiments or the institutions used to carry those experiments out. No glance at the cost of oppression and suppression, at the disembowelment of the family and the community Indigenous people once held up as our governments. That version is much more contoured. It recognizes layers of control and power and greed and the insatiability of wheat to go that is colonization at its core. That version is in fact a version of the Indians' problem rather than the Indian problem. Today, we are discussing the Indians' problem around identity, and it is anything but a simple issue. Jean gave you just a few examples of how complex this issue is. And this seems to have become our problem, even though we are not the ones doing anything wrong. That's so interesting. This is part of our reality. We're often asked to do that cleanup work. Context for this topic on identity is important. And of course, we started our day with Chancellor Sinclair. And almost every time I speak now at this point, I use quotes from him. And I thought, oh man, we're both going to be singing from his prayer book today. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm just going to recap and say, every time I speak with reality that we're all the people here are living with the issue of a crisis of identity. And we ask ourselves, where do we come from? Why are we here? Who are we? And where are we going? I really thought about this over the last few months as we've seen this identity issue more exposed than it's ever been. Who are we? Who are we past the titles, past the job category? Who are we? I want us to remember, this is taking in lots of what you've already heard this morning. We're inclusive. We have built our kinship. Marie mentioned this already. There's value in knowing who we are and learning from community connection. Jackie mentioned this through the teachings of Elder Armstrong. We have networks and we're taught to honor the relationship, not the transaction. That's who we are. We are not exclusionary. We're spiritual. We know that we have context and responsibility within a worldview, not a consumeristic domination perspective. We are the relatives of the flyers, the crawlers, the swimmers, the four-legged. We have obligations not only to each other, but to them, and of course to Mother Earth. We're humble. We know we are dependent on the planet. We are the smallest ones. The planet would do great without us. We know exclusion was our form of punishment, banishment, as a last resort, a last resort. We relied on banishment or termination of that relationship only in extreme cases where the whole was threatened. We're not greedy, we share. We did not run a system on majority rules or single male-headed corporate-style hierarchical structures. We had shared models of power and governance based on expertise, responsibility, and inclusion. That's who we are. Now, here we are at a time when the question of indigeneity as a credential is being reviewed institutionally all over the country. This work is emotional, spiritual, it's intellectual, and it's physical. As an issue that's evolved to a point where Indigenous people have had to band together to identify who is preying on our genealogies, our spiritual existence, our connectedness to our detriment, they're sucking out the aspect of who we are, where we belong, our voice, and our value. And it has rallied many people from their work, from their lives, from their families, and from their community to demand this stop. It is not who we are to exclude. We are kinship-based and relational. So our reaction to this with groups about pretendians and angry words and emails of exclusion and outrage tells me something. We are threatened and reacting. We aren't sharpshooters at exclusion, so we need to practice this. We need to get better at this, not take out the wrong people. We're in survival. Survival is key as we see the integrity of our language, our ceremonies, our customs, our land, our families, reaching points of extinction. My presentation notes have a watermark on them, so I wouldn't forget context for my own layers as I prepared for this talk today. Marilyn, speak with kindness, speak with wisdom, speak with love. But in all honesty, if I speak with any wisdom I can conjure up, if I speak with the kindness that I hope would be extended to me, I also speak with love. It just happens to be the love of a mother bear whose cubs have been threatened. And here's what I want to say. Fraudulent claims of non-Indigenous people are not the Indian problem. They're not even an Indian's problem. We are not the ones trying to claim the seat, the power, the job, the funding, the promotion based on fraudulent identity, fake expertise, and a tangential connection to our history, our land, and our people. This is a problem for the white community, the non-Indigenous folks. But since they are not legislated over culturally, racially, or communally, they're unidentifiable. They become part of the furniture in the rooms where we are discussing the issue of Indigenous identity or MMIWG2S or racial profiling for a plethora of institutions. So the visible ones end up being us. And we end up speaking out, wearing the issue, doing the policing, finding the policies, and ultimately purchasing the whistles to blow so we can be heard and protect what needs to be protected. Why do Indigenous people have to be the ones who identify this issue and raise it and research it over and over, present it, be ignored by it, present it again, whistleblow? Because the invisible non-Indigenous people have nothing to lose in this. They have no skin in the game. And as we see institutions who have supported and promoted non-Indigenous colleagues actually gain acclimate and acclaim for the work of those colleagues, why would they pressure that? Why would they give that up? To be honest, identity was rarely checked on. Few checked on it or verified credentials, and they certainly didn't, as we see now it's coming, go to an Indigenous expert panel. So that's being born as we speak. There were just a few of us to raise the safety issue in the past. We couldn't talk about it. There weren't enough of us to protect each other, and we couldn't. So now there's lots more of us, and we can have these conversations. In the past, it was easy to say you were Indigenous and have the proof of it be sketchy at best. Why? Because there was no lineups for the benefits falling out of the Indian Act. There was no lineup for the labeling of you as an Indian when the past practice of that was to keep us out of cities and towns, off land for the purpose of settlement, to rip children from us, to violently rape and murder our women Who signs up for that? Even affirmative action programs for education and employment opportunities were sometimes looked at as the hiring of the bottom feeders, those not capable of getting a door opened on their own. I've even heard some in my own community say, I didn't get this job or admission to this program because I was Indigenous. I didn't need that. We've been trained into shame for identity in many, many, many institutional practices, rewarded to discuss our poor upbringing or the fact that the doors had to be held open for us, to be amazed if we get an education or good jobs or become a leader. We're never asked about the doors we opened ourselves or the doors we built or the doors we had to kick in. That's not how the Indian problem works. It was also easy until now to say you were Indigenous and have the proof be sketchy at best because the proof of documentation that was relied on was simply not as institutionalized as it is today. There were really only Indian cards back in the day that were controlled and regulated. Many Indigenous nations had problems with accuracies of lists, with corruption in government, cards were sold, no resources to create, monitor, or verify and maintain a list, lack of responsibility for the children being sired, paternalistic measures for who owned the wives, who owned the children, mass destruction of identity intentionally done through the kidnapping of children for institutional experiments or the eradication of family and cultural teachings. But today, as shame and guilt rise from the foundations of the old corrupt institution, so do the desire to fix and include. It erupts in our institutions. With the realization that diversity is rich, doors are being opened with the intention to include another perspective. There are more opportunities for Indigenous people. But we also see, and it's why we're here, that there are people who found a back door to a room they would not otherwise be admitted to. Some non-Indigenous folks caught on to this early in their careers and played the system for work, for education, for funding. So let's be honest. There's more to this than we need to remember. Indigenous people there's more to this. Let's just keep this in our minds. Indigenous people here are at home. We belong. We know who we are. We know where our families are. And that's not something you can buy or trade or fake or conjure up. The mental health of not being accepted or belonging is staggering in Canada right now. I understand why others would want to be attached to that. But to suck the life force out of Indigenous identity is desperate and touches that insatiable sweet-to-go spirit. So we react rather than build our kinship networks. We find ourselves working towards banishing the people who threaten our existence, the existence of our future. This has awoken us. You've heard Jean talk this morning about the difference between nation and community, who decides over citizenship. You heard Marie Sinclair talk about that already as well. What are the results of that? Where are our laws in this? As somebody who is working in Indigenous laws and trying to get those into the mainstream, customary adoption is one of the strands of our kinship system that holds us together and support us. Remember that it is a family gathering process or system, that adoption process. It's not one for keeping people out or disrespecting them. It was kind and inclusive and created responsibility, not a right. Who is your grandma? Not your grandma in the tougher sense, or my dad's tougher than you. Your grandma that teaches you belonging and connectedness. That's what you get from the teachings of a grandma. Reliance on customary law as a last-ditch effort to claim indigeneity is a bastardization of our traditional laws. Laws we are working so hard to have respect for, and to use, to teach, and to have responsibility in our communities. There is no shame in being customarily adopted into an Indigenous family or being an honorary member of a community. If you are, own it, love it. Love that your family's extended, that you have Indigenous support systems available to you. It doesn't make you Indigenous or First Nations or Treaty or Métis. Do your work in community because of it, but don't wait until your life and work as an Indigenous person are being scrutinized to pull out the Indigenous adoption law as your evidence for being Indigenous. For me, it's a telltale sign of a desperate grab for an illusory sense of belonging. You're going to hear a lot over the next few days. Listen with your hearts, listen with your minds. Be careful who we include and exclude. We have to be very careful of that. We are not exclusionary by nature. We have so much important work to do. We have nations to build and youth to build up and self-confidence to instill and our own laws to monitor. We have to tell our leaders to take responsibility. We have to see that the institutions we participate in are doing it in a wholesome, good way, not in a policing kind of way. We have so much work to do, and I am going to really enjoy listening for the next 2 days to see what everybody wants to contribute to that. Thank you.
Oh, this is a hard act to follow. Thank you both, Jean and Marilyn. Wonderful words. And thank you so much, the appreciation for the invitation today to speak, for the opening prayers and the opening words from Senator Sinclair. Really wonderful. I'll give myself a quick introduction because I don't feel that maybe you wouldn't know me the way you might know Jean or Marilyn, but Tansei. Megasio Isquel Nitsigasadan, Pakadagan Otsi. My name is Leah Ballantyne. I'm from the Treaty 6 territory, from the community of Pakadawagan, Manitoba. I'm a 60s scoop person, so identity's been an issue that I have worked through my entire life. But I grew up in the city of Winnipeg. I was adopted to a Scottish family. Grew up in the city of Winnipeg till I was a teenager, where some things happened where it was probably best my family move, which we could tie into MMIW type issues just to kind of gloss over that era. And I ended up in British Columbia with my family, and ended up at a school, Native Education Center, where there were some really wonderful people who helped me connect with my home community. And I was able to get my status card and connect with my family up in Pakadawagan. And so I went home for the first time when I was 19, and it just happened to be that the life-serving chief at the time, late Pascal Biggity, was my uncle, and he grew up and was best friends with my late biological mother. So it was easy to make the connection that way. And then since then, it's been a wonderful relationship with my family at home in Puck, and also where I live here in British Columbia. So I will say that I'm coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Stalo and Chehalis Sham peoples here in Harrison Hot Springs in British Columbia. I spend half my time here in BC and half of it in Manitoba. I feel very honored to work with my First Nation community in Pakadawagan with Chief Laura Biggity and Council. And I also do work here with an organization that represents 23 First Nations within the Lower Fraser region of British Columbia. So I also, as a lawyer, I'm a member in British Columbia and Manitoba, so I can support both communities. And I very much feel like I have one foot in each world, and that my 2-eye seeing is very accurate because I'm forced to live in that world. I'm also one of those people where we have non-Indigenous people asking, and I have to answer a lot of these hard questions and do the cleanup work, as Marilyn has suggested, when things like the Kamloops discovery happened. And, you know, I've got neighbors in this integrated Canadian community who care and want to, you know, contribute in a meaningful way or have questions answered. Unfortunately, I get to wear that hat, and sometimes I find it really challenging, not only to answer some of these questions, because I don't feel it's my right always to do that, because my perspective might be my own, my opinion is my own, but also that that's perpetuating some of the settler colonial violence that I believe we all experience. So the reason why I was asked to participate in this panel today is because of the issues that I raised about harm and potential redress to this issue of stolen Indigenous identity for the purposes of advancing one's career. And I wrote a letter to the University of Saskatchewan. And as you may be aware, in the introduction, I was announced as a former US Senate member. And I did attend the University of Saskatchewan for 1 year as an undergrad. And I was a student senator on the Senate committee at the university. So when this issue arose about the stolen Indigenous identity and the tenureship and career that went with it, I felt it very personally. I felt harmed. I felt like, you know, this opportunity could have been something that maybe one of my family members could have benefited from, but instead it's one of the rare opportunities that's been taken away. And I want to address this because not only did this personally kind of it irks something in me, it also is an issue. I have friends that work in the Public Service Commission of Canada. I have friends that are artists. I have different friends across Canada who are many different areas within society, and this issue continues to keep evolving, and I felt the need to address it in a way that perhaps nobody has. So I stirred the pot by suggesting that this is a white collar crime and that it could attract charge under the Criminal Code of Canada. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the letter, albeit redacted, that I submitted, and why that I thought that this could be a potential way to redress the harm, or at least for to prevent anyone from considering this course of action and a consequence to the action of Indigenous identity theft. So I introduced myself in the letter saying I'm a member of the Matthias Cologne Cree Nation, signatory to Treaty 6, which your university domiciles. I'm alma mater and former student senator at the University of Saskatchewan. I write to you today with a request for action and consequence of the perpetrated and calculated fraud committed of Indigenous identity theft. The depth and duration of Indigenous identity theft is fostered in an environment where both academia and the university have failed to uphold a vetting policy for faculty who claim Indigenous self-identification in order to advance their career. This has been to the detriment of deserving Indigenous scholars, students, and the community at large. This is a crime of fraud worth consideration of Section 381 of the Criminal Code of Canada. This avoidable crime must be addressed by the university in a public way that allows punishment and reparation to the Indigenous community who has suffered the harm, including people like myself. I was involved in a pan-Canadian Indigenous-led health research project whose goals were to support Indigenous-led governance and the promotion of ethical research policy frameworks with international relevance for Indigenous people. Our work within that project could be undermined by the inclusion of false dialogue and drafting of important governance documents and structure. Contributions to ethical research led by Indigenous people relying on a false and harmful narrative are harmful to us all. The university needs to take immediate action on the issue of vetting Indigenous candidates applying for academic or research positions. I implore the university to enact a vetting policy that includes a committee of local and distinguished Indigenous community members who are trusted to make decisions on the validity of claiming Indigenous identity. I also urge universities to consider a charge of fraud for the evolving frauds of Indigenous identity during career or tenureship or research at any institution. To fail at correcting and punishing this perpetrated and calculated crime would cause further damage to the Indigenous community, of which I am proudly part. So that was the letter that I provided to the university. So of course there's a harm there. There's a consequence to that harm, and then there's a request for redress. And so the redress, it sounds like many of us are in agreement that it should be a vetting process where we have Indigenous, respected Indigenous community members look over applications, whether they're students or researchers or for faculty, to ensure that these claims are, they can be vetted in some way. And there's many ways. We've discussed the ways that Indigenous communities own our own. And so it's not through a long distance ancestor, a great grandmother of some sort. We're talking about real people and real lives and relevant families that are part of our communities today. Like, for example, I would never have been able to go home and meet my home family community if they were all distant relatives who were 6 feet under. You know, these families are very much alive today, and now we have relationships, and it's not a matter of whether you even have status or non-status. These family members know, we know who we are. For example, even in Saskatchewan, although I'm a Treaty 6 member from Matthias Cologne in Pugatawagan, I carry the last name of Valentine. And so my great grandfather came from the Peter Ballantyne band. And so we have the connections in Saskatchewan even to say, oh, I know your grandfather's family, and here's some of your aunt and uncles that you may or may not know, but we can make that connection. And I really feel that if we can have a vetting process that involves respected community members at large to review these types of claims, that I think that respectfully, we can vet those people, much like you would vet a resume, and somebody might get on the phone and say, hey, you know, you claim here you got your master's degree at this university, and I'm going to phone and make sure that that's true. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. So, you know, the one aspect of on the extreme level of my suggestion that the Criminal Code of Canada could be attracted almost serves as a deterrent for anyone in the future to think that this is not some easy thing where I can just tick the box and away we go with, you know, managing to find a space to advance a career when it's really not warranted. But really just a way, a deterrence. And I really feel that we have our own knowledge within ourselves, in our connections with our families, our communities, our nations, and with each other, that we can address these issues in a way that's respectful and inclusive of everybody. Thanks.
Wow. I was just sitting here making comments that I've got my son here sitting with me today, but I said, how does it feel to be in a room with 3 people you know you'll never be smarter than? And so, yeah, no, I've got pages and pages of notes of this, and I'm going to get us through. We've got some a Q&A period, so I'm going to ask our presenters if they could be ready. I'll start with one question that is a little bit targeted. I think this one is for Jean, so then we'll start that way. There we do have a comment. Jean, nice threads. We have a comment there, so that's no, that small joke, the
Nice
small joke, but
threads.
yeah. We got a question first from James. So James Makokis asks, does it breach privacy laws if one were to call the Métis Nation office or Indian band that one is claiming membership or belonging to confirm their claims?
Say, James, I can't see you, but haven't seen you for a long time. But thanks for the question. I don't think it does breach privacy laws, and I think Leah led us there earlier, where so if you've put on your resume that you are a member of such and such a band, then I think, or that you are a member, like I say, I'm a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation, and it's on my resume and I'm applying for a job or for a scholarship to go get into med school or something like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with the people who are reviewing that picking up the phone, as Leah said, and phoning the Manitoba Métis Federation registry and saying, so this person has applied for da 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 da, and she says she's a member, and I just wanted to check. And I think they can give you that answer. They can't give you personal information about that person, like you can't ask them for anything other than that, probably. But I think that that's quite legitimate, and in fact, that's what needs to happen. Is that when we're talking about verifying or what is I was trying to remember what the word Murray used, rationalizing or validating someone's claim. What we're saying is you have to be able to validate it. And the only way to do that is to go back to the sources. So that may be the community or the band office. It might be the, like I said, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan or the Manitoba Métis Federation. And if you don't have a card, it might also be talking to other people who come from that community and say, you know, they might not know that individual, but do you know that family? Do you know who those people are? So I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I don't think it breaches privacy laws at all.
Can I add something, Jane? I think we have to really say institutions have to pick that up. So in the application process, you have a box that said this will be verified by whatever nation you're attaching yourself to or whatever community you're attaching yourself to, and have the applicant okay that. And then also, you know, on the other side of, do nations determine identity, that nations need to build the mechanism in to be able to confirm or deny such things and to be able to ask. So there's work in the middle of that, even
I think
though
you're
it
right.
looks like there's a path to it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Marilyn, but I think you're right. In the application form, they can have a thing at the bottom that says that in making this application, I agree that you can check on anything that everything I've said here is true, and that you can check on it. And
Just like
that's,
you
I
check
think, what you're
about
talking about.
Exactly. We do it all the time.
Yeah, and we check letters of reference. Like you phone up the people, you list 3 people who are your references, you call them up. So yeah.
Awesome. Leah, anything to add to that one? If not, I'll move to the next question.
Yeah, absolutely. They're all very practical measures you can take to verify one's identity. So those are all really great examples. Thanks.
Perfect. So I got another question from Paula. Who decides as a nation who gets adopted? Will this cause further division within the nations and traditional governance versus elected officials, decision makers? And this one's not directed to anyone, so whoever would like to start.
I can start, but then just say that I know that there are examples of people who have been brought in by the nation, adopted by the nation, right? And so in talking to Dr. Veldon Coburn in, I think he's at the University of Ottawa, and he was talking about how his nation had brought in this person who actually was born and raised on the reserve, but was actually a settler. And then the nation adopted him in officially, not just the family, but the nation did it. So that's, I think, a legitimate, I don't mean legitimate, but that's them doing their standard custom laws and traditions. The only one I know of in the Métis Nation is Lawrence Barkwell, who the Manitoba Métis Federation had a big gathering and they made him an associate member of the Manitoba Métis Federation in honor of, dozens of years of extraordinary historical work that he had done for them. But in being an associate member, which I think Lawrence was very proud of, that he was that, he never thought it made him Métis, and he never voted or anything like that. He was just it's an honorific, right? It's like, I have 3 honorary doctorates, right? But, you know, I mean, you don't want me to be, you know, going into the hospital and doing a surgery, right? I mean, now mine are doctorates of laws, but they are basically honorifics. They're awards, right? So an adoption in is almost like that. It's an honorific. And if we think about it that way, I think that's more helpful. So
I just want to add, customary adoption is just so close to my heart. I've just looked so hard and long at this, and I want to be very clear with people that, you know, there are informal and formal mechanisms to this. There are nations and individuals, families who have done a customary ritualistic adoption in addition to a legal adoption. There are adoptions that are very informally done with family members, and there are adoptions that have much, much ritual around them. And so, and all of those are seen as valid because adoption in our community isn't about taking ownership of a person. It doesn't just apply to children, it applies to any age. And it's not about a property right. It's about a responsibility and a connection to build that relationship. And so you have to get the lens of customary adoption into your mind to say, what are we talking about? And though I agree with Jean, what's the difference between being brought into a nation and brought into a family? That's a bunch of lawyers sitting around and talking about it. That's not the practice in communities. There's not clear laws that nations do this and families do this and communities do that. So that's our homework. Like, we have to pressure our leaders to do those things and to say, this is when this applies and this when this doesn't apply. And to know that if you've got an elder that you've been really sweet to, and she's going to name you and she's going to say, you're like my daughter and you can call me mother, that doesn't put you on the election ability to vote, and it doesn't make you Indigenous or Cree or, you know, or Haudenosaunee or any of those things. It's a responsibility that you have to that family, and you get that support network. So we need to build infrastructure because our oral traditions don't have all of those mechanisms. So we have a lot of homework.
Yeah, and
Leah?
yes, thank you. To further distinguish, you know, there's customary adoption, and then the adoption that I talk about, that I experienced myself, is an adoption as a member of the class of the 60 Scoop. And so now we have a legal category. We know what that is. Because there's a settlement attached to it, and there's been light shed on what that practice was through the Child and Family Services historically, because we've had the residential school experience where children were forcibly removed from their homes, and then we had the adoptions of the 60 Scoop where children, Indigenous children, were forcibly removed from their homes and communities and adopted out to typically European descent families. So when I talk about that adoption, that's what I'm talking about. I was days old and taken from the hospital and literally transferred from one group, my home community's family, and adopted out legally to another family. Now, fortunate for my experience that I was able to reconnect with my family, and I now enjoy knowing who I am and where I come from in relationships with my family, being a Cree of the Cree Nation from a community in Pugadawagan. And I know others may not have had similar experiences where they can make that connection. And there's a lot of issues with trying to find sealed records and whatnot. And there are ways to go about that that are beyond this panel. But I want to say, as far as customary adoption goes, and that's when our nations adopt somebody else into our communities as one of our own, that still does not bestow the right or the ability for that person to claim that Indigenous identity, because it is, as both Jean and Marilyn are saying, honorary. And it also brings us to a good point where, you know, we've got the UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and maybe this is something that through the FSIN or any of our political organizations, we really need to look at starting to quantify and articulate in writing customary adoption and what that means to be belonging, including vetting processes that might apply to universities, other public institutions like the Public Service of Canada or the Canada Council for the Arts, etc. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And just so everyone, I'm glued to the screen as well. I get to watch. So when I'm looking left, I'm not trying to look stoic and nice. I'm actually trying to really pay attention to the panelists here as well too. So I got another question from Percy and Raven, Raven Sinclair also. So they kind of both are wondering the same. What legal recourse is there for institutions where fraudsters have usurped roles, funding, and accolades based on their lies and deceptions? Is there recourse for those retaliated against for simply asking, who are your relatives? Is pretendianism a form of academic misconduct? So a little bit of a layered question, but again, panel, response is yours.
Maybe I'll start again first. We seem to have set a pattern, but I think that the first question, I'm just sort of looking in the chat to find Raven's question, but basically, is it? Let me just ask whether it's misconduct. I'll address that first, and so what legal recourse is there? So there is legal recourse, and there's a whole spectrum of things that can happen. Because first of all, if you're talking about somebody who's in a corporate, say government, or an institution like a university, they're employees, and so under employment law, you can definitely look at misconduct for dishonesty. So that's an absolute avenue of that can be taken by way of investigating and exploring that. Now, if they're found to have been dishonest, and that breaches the trust relationship set out in an employment relationship, if that is found, there's any number of actions that can happen. Because there's another spectrum, right? You can be disciplined. In other words, you can have a mark on your employment record. You can be told you have to take workshops or learn something to change what you're doing. They can go all the way from do nothing, or have a little chat with that person to say, you really should change the way you're doing it, to dismissal. And there's a broad spectrum in there that has to be considered. And a lot of those have to do with, was it repeated? Was it a one-off situation? Did they say they were sorry? have they offered to apologize? Like, all those things all factor into where on that spectrum of redress you sit. So that's kind of my first take on that. Leah has already suggested there may be criminal actions. I think those kinds of things are dicier for institutions because they don't want to start charging their employees with criminal activity. So that embroils them in the legal system, and they don't want to go there. So, but it's not to say it isn't an option, but those are choices, right? Now, the last part of that question was, is pretendianism a form of, the one about the people who questioned, right? Just the person who was the whistleblower, which Marilyn raised earlier, right? So the person who's the whistleblower, is there a way of redress in there? And I would say that those are also issues. The whistleblower issues are really tough, and we see that all the way from like the WikiLeaks thing that's gone on with in the United States, to Julian Assange. All of those things are to what's the movie about the woman who blew the whistle on the nuclear power thing? And that's based on a true story. So whistleblowers are almost always tarred with the brush that they raised it. And as much as maybe in history and over time, they get their reputations sort of reestablished and refurbished, it almost always takes time, because you have to understand the people who are the whistleblowers are the ones who are calling out the whole establishment. And what you're whistleblowing is the establishment. You're saying, you guys didn't do this right. You guys let this happen. And they don't like being called out, right? They are sensitive to that and they fight you. And they also don't know what to do. Like, so let me just put it this way. Lots of institutions wear shame very well. It's a garment they're used to, and they just, they're quite comfortable with it. They can just absorb it and they look bad for a couple of days, but it's a 3-day press blowover. And then they just go on their way. They may change some things. Hopefully they would change some things. I think some will. And what happens though, is the more it happens, if you get whistleblowers in many, many institutions, all blowing about the same thing, then they have to change. And I think that's actually where we're at right now, is that the change is happening. It's happening all over the place. Now, how it happens and making sure it goes in the right direction and all those things, those are all the things we all need to be vigilant about. But I think the reputations take a hit, and there's no question about it. And there are lots of people in those institutions who don't agree with this, right? So it's a problem, and I very much appreciate the difficulties of, and I appreciate the bravery of people who will stand up at risk to their jobs and their own reputations and stand up and say things, because it's tough. It's very tough.
They're very typically women. So we actually traditionally called them matriarchs. Whistleblower is not our term, and they're leaders. And so how do we honor them? What are we doing to treat those people as somebody that we respect, that did everything they could to institutionally follow the procedures that were available, and they were just, the doors were closed over and over, and they're now being painted as the problem? That's a huge issue. And I think the other thing, there's, so institutionally, so Jean's laying out, you can have institutional recourse and perhaps punishment, and institutions individually have to figure out what that is. If you do this, the University of Saskatchewan's got some 7 unions to deal with this. And I think that's one of the questions that's in the list here is what do you do with the multiple unions that you're dealing with? Well, we have to sort that out. That's the messiness of it. And then what are the types of responses to it? What are the remedies to this? And when you look at, a lot of sexual assault cases are now going to civil litigation because the criminal process is so empty and unfulfilling, and the standard is, can you throw one thing in the room to dispute what's going on in there? And if you use a civil recourse, there's a balance of probabilities. It's a totally different test where it's quite likely that this happened. What are we going to do? And so there's a way to redress that. Now, what are we redressing? What the answer for us from community is, are we using a punishment hierarchical colonial model to deal with this? And maybe we are, and there will be people that support that. Or are we about education and reparation of the relationship in the community? How does that person make amends to what they've done? How do they give back? Do they give back? And there's questions about whether they have to give back the funding they've gotten, the money from the job they've had for decades. With some of them, this is decades long. How would we even trace all of that, right? So I just want to be really clear that there's multiple institutional ways, from institutions like universities or government to court structures, to deal with things like this, and that we haven't got things in place for this. This is that new.
Yeah, and I agree with both Marilyn and Jean. And so the suggestion that I made about invoking a criminal code charges against people, that actually was a suggestion that I made to stir up the conversation. And I'm so glad that we're here today to actually have this dialogue. But it doesn't seem very feasible to have a criminal charges laid. But there is the reality that white collar crime is always underreported and undercharged. Mm-hmm. And the people who are guilty of those white collar crimes are underserved to redress those harms or have any real consequence come to them in the form of any type of reparation, whether it be a time served or paying back or whatnot. But I think with this dialogue, we can look at potential reparation or redress to the community at large. And so us having this conversation is the beginning of that step forward. And I really think that if people are going to continue to self-identify, that again, the responsibility is on you. Every time you sign a document with your signature, you are agreeing and consenting that this is a real, true, verifiable information about yourself. Of course, it would include Indigenous identity.
Thank you. And maybe building on that one a little bit, we got Justin shared a concern that there's where we put that burden, will institutions be compensating our nations for the labor and time to verify that citizenship? You know, and it probably was answered a little bit. I think Jean mentioned, you know, that institutions are going to have to decide on what their collective responses would be, but maybe you can speak to maybe sharing in some of that concern as well too. And I think it was spoken about even this morning of like it kind of lines up really well with that Indian problem, you know, like where an issue gets identified, well, let's go to them to get them to solve it, right? When it's really a lot of colonial baggage, we're all just trying to wash off almost, it seems like. But maybe getting back to Justin's question, a concern about further burdening are really under-resourced levels of government, right?
Yeah, that's such a problem because it happens all the time in so many situations where it's like downloading onto the Métis group or to the Métis Nation or to the band or the First Nation. It happens all the time, and this is another one of those. My guess is that there won't be any compensation. But the problem with all this, and I was so interested that Marilyn raised the reference to women going to the courts to try and address sexual assault, because I was thinking about that too when we talk about this as our problem, right? That it's a problem first and that it's our problem. But if we label it that way, that to me is like saying that rape is a woman's problem, right? Or rape is the men's problem. But actually both people have to deal with it, right? You can't just say that. I think that yes, when you're talking about rape, you can say that, you know, there's a huge issue with male violence against women. We know that, right? But wow, as a woman, I want to be able to protect myself. I want to be able to stand up and be able to do something about that. I want to protect my children and my grandchildren, my granddaughters. I don't want them to have to deal with that too. So I think we have to just look at this from both sides here. The institutions that Indigenous governments are trying to really clarify their citizens and their members and everything. I think that's happening all over the country. I think that that's the move where First Nations or bands take over their own membership roles, right? They're taking it over because they want to be able to decide who their people are and not have people's grandchildren get knocked off the roll because of some crazy number on the Indian Act, right? So they don't want to do that. I've been in meetings. I remember James Washi in the Northwest Territory standing and saying, nobody's going to tell me my granddaughter's not Clichon. Nobody is going to tell me that. And he was like really, really intense. And I think that's how everybody feels about it, right? And that's it. Nobody's going to tell us who we are, right? So in that sense, are they going to compensate us for that? Probably not. I doubt it. But should we be getting help from perhaps the federal government to say we need financial resources to clarify who our people are, to do that work? We need support to do that work. Stay out of the issue, right? But give us the resources so that we can do the work ourselves, because it's work and it costs. And we got to set up our own systems. So I sort of think that's I think it'll be a frosty day in hell before the university's going to pay you to do that on every single scholarship application and every single student who applies to a position in school and every single faculty member and every single staff. I don't think that's going to happen. So.
You know, one of the things that I say about truth and reconciliation every time I talk directly about truth and reconciliation is that it's a really, really uncomfortable space. And if you don't feel it, if you aren't feeling uncomfortable, like moving around in your chair and agonized by it and disturbed by it, then you're not in the middle of it. That's just the truth. If you aren't feeling it, you aren't in it. And it's uncomfortable for us. It's uncomfortable for the institutions. It's uncomfortable for the people who are being uncovered, who are erupting out of these institutions. It's uncomfortable. And so we're talking about capacity. You know, there's another question in the history here of, you know, what if the band doesn't have that list and doesn't have the technology to get it at their fingertips, and that it's like, that's a capacity question. What if there's no person designated? How often is this going to happen? How do you build this into a band or a governance process? Like, that's a capacity issue. But it's also a capacity issue for the institutions that we're talking about. They have no capacity to understand. They are not informed about what this means, the depths of the harm that is coming from this, and the depths of the disruption. This is chickens coming home to roost from colonization, from scooping kids for histories, and from beating women. This is the chickens coming home to roost. So you know, I have a son. I am a very proud half-breed, and I have a son with a Cree man, and my son cannot be a half-breed because he's registered as a Cree baby. And he could be German and Cree or Polish and half-breed, but he cannot be a half-breed Cree. That's ridiculous. I got issues with the federal government not wanting us to cross boundaries with, he can't be Inuit and this, he can't, because they want their list to be clean and they don't want the Indigenous folks fraternizing in any way and double dipping and all of this crazy lack of understanding. And so there's lots of definitions of identity. There's political definitions of identity. There's familial definitions of identity, there's cultural definitions of identity, and there's financial definitions of identity. And our job right now is to figure out how to put those things in the same room, because nobody's done it. And so it's hard work. It's really uncomfortable.
And so we're in an era now where we're looking at the articulation of our own laws. And so I'll keep it short and sweet because I see the time, but for self-identification, yes, we do have capacity issues. And so I also propose this. Anytime you're going to an Indigenous community, be it elders, knowledge holders, other community members and families, you need to compensate all those people as experts for their time, because the only way we're going to get at the true articulation of our laws around self-identification and get the language right for each and every nation, it's going to be different. We need to have that capacity, and we need to make sure that everybody is adequately and fairly compensated for the time that they put towards articulating these issues.
I know we're running to the end of our time here, but I've just been given a note. If I could ask the panel to pay attention to Dr. Robert Innes's question there. From what I understand, we can only ask people to provide proof of identity if the position is specifically for an Indigenous position because of the human rights codes. If so, a person can self-identify as Indigenous and the university will not be able to disclose. Is this correct?
You know, the issue of what the university can disclose about anything about a person. So, you know, the issue for me is, why would we want the university to disclose? So if you're talking about, say, a student who identified as Indigenous in order to get their undergrad degree, and then they go to another university to do a master's degree, and I guess what you're saying is then that university is going to phone back to the first one and say, this kid identified as Métis? Is that what the question is? So all the university would be able to say is yes, but they would probably only be able to do that if, like Marilyn had pointed us to first, that there's a sort of a box on the bottom saying, I will allow da 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 da. So those are the kinds of work on our application forms and with the HR offices in universities that need to be done about what can be disclosed to whom and under what circumstances. And I know for a fact that the universities across the country are well into this discussion. They're very aware of what's going on here and that they need to, it's a matter of consent, right? So if, for example, when people, I know the Métis Nation of one of the provinces was doing a lot of health research, right? And trying to figure out levels of diabetes in the community, right? All good work needs to be done. We need to know how prevalent this is. But they ask specifically during the question period, can we use this information as an aggregate information or whatever for the purposes of research, right? So you're getting advance consent from the people about how your information can be disclosed. And so either on the first university where it would be, yes, you can use this for other academic queries, or on the one from the new university, the one you're going to do your master's at, where you say, yes, you can check. I give you my consent to check with them. Or you get letters from the university, you write to the university and you say, you may get a query about da 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 da. There are ways around all of this sort of discussion here about it. But I think we have to treat the Indigenous connection as a verification process in the same way that you are allowed to go and check references, and in the same way that you are allowed to check people's marks, and you're allowed to check people's saying that I have a PhD from Harvard, right? You're allowed to check all of those things, and I think you should be able to, and I go back to my first statement, this is not a privacy right, and it's not an individual right in the same way as other issues are. I think we have to really distinguish those two things.
And Jean, would you agree then that could just be done by universities making that the policy? If you claim at any time to be Indigenous, and it's boxes on application forms, that it will be verified. And in order to make this claim, you will agree to have that verification done through the connecting to whoever. So I think that needs to be built in. Whether you're a student, whether it's a job you're applying for, if there's just a job at the university for housekeeping and anyone applies, do we need to check whether that person is Indigenous or not? What hasn't come up yet. If that person wants to be promoted, so I think that we just need to build those into institutional processes. But another thing that you raised, Jean, which is quite interesting and would maybe happen, is, are institutions allowed to verify that among each other? Or do you go back to the nations to do that? I think that's up for discussion about what we share with people. And again, you'd have to okay that as the person getting checked out.
Yeah, and
sorry, go
ahead, Jean, sorry.
Go ahead, Leah. No, go ahead, Leah. I see Robert's asked another clarification. But go ahead, Leah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that any application to any position within these institutions, it's voluntary. Nobody's forcing you to actually apply. So when you provide your consent to the application, your signature is your consent. So the university has to articulate what that policy about the vetting and of course the verification, whether it's your degrees, your references, and your self-identification tick box, that would need to be verified and vetted. And of course, you're consenting via your signature.
And one last thing, because Robert's clarified that it's a position not specific to an Indigenous person, I don't think that matters. universities are in this whole process of what they're calling indigenization, right? And so they're not necessarily putting things forward as Indigenous positions, but they are looking for Indigenous people to do it, and they're hiring because you're Indigenous, right? And as the minute they're hiring, whether it's advertised that way or not, whether they're hiring because you're Indigenous, that puts you in that place. And so, but I agree with Leah, it's the universities have big policy work to do here, and they need to do it with Indigenous peoples so that they get it right. Because the last thing we want them to do is spend the next year working on their policies about all this, and then the Indigenous people go, whoa, what'd you do? That's all wrong. So we've got to do it together here, but they need policies. And this is going to answer a question that somebody else asked, which is, what do you do about the people who are already there? You got to do policies first. You can't just start on a hunt for people. You've got to set out clear policies about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And that would include new hires as well as the people who are already there. And then that will help protect so that people don't have to be whistleblowers.
We need to be really clear that this is going to end up in a courtroom. It is. It's
Yeah.
going to. I wish we didn't run to colonial systems to work on things like this, but that's what we have and that's where we go. And so there's institutional fear about who's going to put their neck on that line so that that conversation can start happening. If we get ahead of it in the meanwhile, we can head that off. We can start to develop those relationships to be able to make sure we're doing it right and well. And the other people that when we're thinking about compensation, just to jump off of what Leah just said, is the staff and faculty that we know in these institutions, the Indigenous staff and faculty that are shouldering this issue right now, in addition to all of the work they're already doing. And so there's institutions need to be responsible to that.
Yeah, in our panel here, you can hear we're all imploring the university to enact a vetting policy that would include committees of local and distinguished Indigenous community members who are trusted to make decisions on the validity of claiming Indigenous identity. This work has to happen with us, nothing about us without us. It will happen with us. And I think that way we can avoid future litigations regarding these issues.
Nice, beautiful wrap up. Great job, Leah.
Thank you very much to the panel. I really like what's going on in the chat. You guys are kind of like me. If you can get free legal advice, let's go get it. So we've got three of the best here in the business by far. And let's give a big, huge thank you, please, to Jean Taye, Marilyn Patra, and Leah Ballantyne, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't want to clap, but I like it. You guys know I'm super clapping, and I'm going to keep clapping after this. But I just wanted to remind folks, we just have a housekeeping issue. You have to keep following the links in your email. They're all separate links for each different session. So I'll just keep reminding folks throughout the day. During the 1 hour lunch break, we'll be live streaming the film Waniska. Waniska means to awaken in Cree, and this documentary highlights a group of elders on the land addressing the importance of Indigenous knowledge. The film was directed by the Elders Council of the First Nations University of Canada with participation from students. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll resume our program at 12:50 p.m. Central Time.